You are the master of this within Ice Blue Sky, Andrew. I'll give you that status. In your considered opinion, what makes a good prompt?
Before you even go near any of the tools, you have to sit down and think about who your client is, what they're trying to achieve, and really try to understand all of that really clearly. There's no such thing as a prompt that produces a perfect output. And if there is, that's when you actually have to start to get worried. But then a piece that's really, really important is the...
Hi, and welcome to the Soapbox, the podcast where we share practical insights from the industry experts, and we talk about pressing issues around achieving B2B marketing growth. I'm Graham. I'm one of the directors here at Ice Blue Sky, and it gives me great privilege today to have Andrew Gray with us. Andrew, it's the first time you've been on a Soapbox podcast with us, yeah?
Yeah, it is actually. I'm very excited.
Fantastic. And I'm looking forward to this conversation because I know you and I have lots of little sidebar conversations around what we're going to talk about. But before we get into the subjects of everything we're going to talk about, why don't you just share with anybody that's not seen you or the audience in general, why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself and your role within Ice Blue Sky?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Andrew. I've been at Ice Blue Sky for coming on 4 years now. My primary area is around ABM best practices and strategy, and that's evolved immensely in the last 3 or 4 years, especially around the introduction of AI. But just in general, it's really trying to help to bring the best thinking possible from our team to our clients.
Fantastic. And I think we'll both agree with the acceleration in AI and what we're doing it. And we're going to be talking about that today, that role around strategy and how we use that. And we were just talking about that actually in the previous podcast. It's become ever so much more important. So today what we're going to do is we're going to lift the lid a little bit because for the last 12, 18 months in the background, Ice Blue Sky has been working on its own AI content application. It's not something that we rushed at. We really have given it a lot of thought in relation to how we want to work with this particular application, how we then use prompting, and that's going to be a big part of what we're going to talk about today because prompting is really key. But from a sort of top-down approach, Andrew, just why don't you describe what we've been up to and how that's really impacted what you're doing in general in relation to content creation?
Yeah, I mean, it has been a real journey that we've been on as an agency and as individuals in the area of AI. I think the biggest learning has always been, just to treat it as not only a tool, but a tool that can enhance what you're doing, not something that is to replace what you're doing. And we spend an awful lot of time really embedding ourselves in the best practices in the context of when we should or shouldn't use it and how best for us to be able to use it to get the best results out for our clients. Yeah,
well, we were talking on the earlier podcast about quality of content, and that's been really important to us because, it's very easy to use the various tools that are available in the market, and we all know what those applications are. But does that give us consistency? Does that give us quality? Is that really giving us the outputs that we need and our clients need to give that level of consistency against brand messaging, and also as well to sort of work with trust and build that trust about the products and services that we're marketing for people. So I know that's been a real sort of key part of what you're doing. Just talk to me about that procedure around where that starts, and then the cadence of that in relation to the end game. Just sure. Share with me your thought process and how you've helped shape that.
Yeah, I mean, it really is a process. It's not something that's a one and done thing. It's something where you develop it very methodically over time. And like any good marketing and advertising approach, especially in something as stringent as ABM, you want to have it start from the base, which is the strategy. And by being able to use those prompts and the AI tools to help you to develop your strategy, that allows you then to create a bed or a baseline from which to do some of the other elements of the journey. From the strategic side, you get into the more along the lines of the content creation, but that doesn't really happen until you've really got that strength of information base, irrefutable source of research and data upon which to build it. And I mean, that's the other part that's really, really important is people talk about content and content at speed and at pace, but what's more important is having content that's based in a strong, rigid base of information that, will hold up over time, and that can't be questioned.
So we call it knowing, don't we? I mean, there are plenty of terminology from various providers and people talking about this, but from our perspective, it's about knowing. It's about that research is going to give us the guidance, the understanding, the actual landscape of, and so what next? What do we do? How much of that is, so obviously when you're creating that, Andrew, and you're prompting that and guiding that, at some point, I guess that's when you stop. So the outputs from that, you say, right, what have we got here? And then is there further prompting? So just talk to me about the sort of prompting protocols, because obviously from our perspective, I know we've put a great deal of effort into that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it becomes centric to Ice Blue Sky. Is just not something that is just generic prompts or generic questions. Just talk to me a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think as with all things that are done properly, it starts off with the thought process. So before you even go near any of the tools, you have to sit down and think about who your client is, what they're trying to achieve, what the end goals are, and really try to understand all of that really clearly. And that's, at that point, that's when you can start to look at some of the prompt engines and some of the ways to do that. What we try to do is to develop a prompt or a series of prompts that actually provide a fairly strong outcome for what we do. And then we try to iterate it over time. But it's really important to take that and to continually sense check it. So there's no such thing as a prompt that produces a perfect output. And if there is, that's when you actually have to start to get worried. Yeah. So you need to look at the results and then using your critical eye and your experience to then question it and refine it until you get to a point where you're comfortable with where it is.
Because it's customer specific, isn't
Absolutely.
it? Yeah, and we're not saying, right, okay, we've now, as you said there, we've nailed the perfect prompt for something. No. You have to look at it on I suppose customer specific, proposition specific, target audience specific. Are there all the things in that consideration?
Absolutely. I mean, even if you have something that puts out, an ideal customer profile, for example, you go into that, but there's probably about 7 or 8 or 9 variables that change every time you do it, even if you've got a generic place to start with or a base prompt to start with. You're constantly looking at all of the things that are important to that client, that individual, that outcome that they're trying to do. There could be, multiple variables to think about. There's all sorts of things.
So this is a single instance. We're not creating prompts and going across all different platforms. We're working in a single instance, prompting that, and then it's given us the answers on a consistent basis. So in relation to client material and how that's working with that, just how's that working?
Well, I mean, once you've got that really good, strong base of information in place, and it's not unlike what you would have used 2-3 years ago before, the proliferation of AI, all that good base information helps to inform what you're doing from a client perspective. So you then take that information and you consider again, what's the purpose of the campaign? What are you trying to get across? Who you're trying to target? All those different nuances have to come into it. And at that point, then you start considering what type of content to deploy, where to deploy it, and then you can use your resources to help to hone that content. The beauty now is that you can take that content and not just produce it at pace, but you can produce it with very nuanced development so that it appeals to different personas, different people, in different people. And this is where we're starting to get into something that I know you're a massive fan to talk about, which is buyer groups. And that's a hugely important thing to consider when you're doing your development.
Yeah, well, we took ourselves off to the ABM conference in November, and we took a bit of a, I'm going to use a term, punt,
Yeah.
because we wanted to talk about buyer group marketing because we could see the development in the background, but we could also see the need of the buyers. And we were talking earlier about the relevance of content and where we need to drive that. So it was all being sort of self-perpetuated internally. Realistically, what we're saying there is that once you've got that pillar of content, you've got that core understanding.
Yeah.
And forgive me, this is all coming from also as well, we're working with customer data or customer content which is sitting in a secure database as well.
Absolutely.
So we're cross-referencing to get the content that we want, referencing that, which never leaves that universe as such within that single instance. But once you've got that core pillar,
Yeah.
that's what I call it. Now, I guess the challenge, and from the client perspective, is and you said it, how nuanced do you want to go?
Absolutely.
So do we take that just to the vertical, aligned to the qualities of the client that you're creating that content for, and you do that first? Or do you leapfrog that in some instances where client says, no, I just want to go completely into nuancing it at a buyer group level? And when we say that, it's about creating content at IT, procurement, C-suite, operations, and giving nuanced creation of the narrative to be super relevant to those people. So, you know, that's got to be a core consideration. And what are you seeing in relation to that so far? Where are you seeing that's being taken by and the needs of our customers?
I mean, at the end of the day, I think you need to have that core asset first to start with, because that talks about all of the primary elements of the client or the customer that you're trying to put the campaign out there for. So, that's the really important thing. Where it really starts to challenge, and that's where the nuances come in, is all of the offerings for client A are really interesting, but they have a different importance to different elements within an organization. So it may be really important to the CISO for this particular element to it, but for the finance team, it could be the ROI on it, or it could be CapEx, or there's lots of different things about it. The board may have a completely different reason for wanting to consume that information. So the important part is to get the really core bits of information down there, and then to just tweak it slightly so that it really appeals to the individuals. I mean, it's not unlike how, you look at marketing from a non-buyer group perspective. You try to target the information at the account to address their pain points or their challenges. It's no different when you're doing it within an organization, within buyer groups. You try to target the assets or the information to the pain points of the different buyer groups so that they can all see the relevance. And that's where you get the synergies, and you get people coming together and making a joined up decision for different reasons, but for the same product.
Yeah, we spoke about it earlier, but that definitely deal velocity, and we know that's a common pain point in the marketplace right now, because we've got an increasing number of buyers that you've got to market to, and you've got to drive that consensus. And, my favorite phrase at the moment is, well, why should the brand be always the annoying fly in the room? Because we also know the number of touch points that you've got to go in a marketing and sales process to get to a really sort of solid point of consideration. So driving that consensus, I guess, getting buying groups to self-refer, drive consensus, must improve, the theory behind it is must improve that deal velocity. And in fact, we are seeing that in certain instances now, or even getting that conversation with sales at a more relevant stage.
For sure. I mean, that's, you talk about buyer groups and deal velocity, and the challenge is in the world today, some of these people that come together in the room to make a decision on something in particular may not have even known that they were all involved in it. There may have been no connections between them before they sat down to discuss this new product that you're attempting to sell them. When you market to them in the buyer group way, each of them has already got a certain level of understanding and why it benefits them, so that when they do sit down at the table together, even if they don't necessarily know they're all involved potentially, they have at least a solid ground and a solid basis to talk about. But when you start to involve some of the other things that some of our models do, for example, in the self-referrals and the internal referrals, that's when you start to get people talking about things before they sit down and meet. That's when you make it change from individuals coming together for a decision to a group of people coming together to discuss the reasons why.
So we're not really looking at a volume play here, are we? We're not looking at a mass spray and pray to like thousands of prospects. What we're talking about is very considered approach to a real key target. So obviously defining who those accounts are, the people within that. Do you find that that's a challenge, actually building the data sets out for the people that we've got to engage with across those buying groups? How difficult or how much involvement have you had in relation to that? Because once we've got all this great content, and it's about how do we find the right people to get them to, I suppose.
I mean, I think that's been part of the revelation of this whole move towards buyer groups is typically what you've always relied on is doing the research within a particular group of people, and a lot of it is dealt with in terms of who the sales team feels is the buyer. But what you're evolving it to is who are the people outside of the scope of those regular sales interactions that are the influencers and the decision makers that also influence those decisions. And that's where when you build out those buyer groups properly and do some research that typically goes beyond the database that the clients will have, that's when you start to expand that sphere of influence. And that's where AI and prompting can be very useful because it really does help you to define those extended groups of people to reach out to that the sales team may not have any interactions with, and to do it in a way that allows you to bring relevance to the content and the information you're sending to them.
So I suppose, and you can probably back me up on this, the creation of the content, and then obviously what we do with that, and where do we put it, and how do we deploy it? We'll put that to one side.
Sure.
But I suppose that's where the economies of scale are coming from, to be able to create that varied content at speed, relevant, consistency with trust. That's where the real upside is. But I guess it's the front end of that where it takes a little bit longer now because we're going into more of a deep dive of planning, consideration and understanding around that mapping, as we call it, before we even push the button on prompting.
Absolutely.
Are you seeing sort of going through sort of several meetings or a few calls with clients to define that before we get to that point where we're starting to prompt, sort of laying the ground?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of there definitely is more conversations around it, which again is only a good thing because it brings that, the sales and marketing teams closer together, which is really important in an ABM type of approach. But I think what's interesting is when you go into those meetings, it's not always getting information from the client that helps us to inform where we're going. But sometimes by doing the work up front, we can actually say to them, but don't forget this particular area because this has a real influence because of this. It may not have been something that they would necessarily look at, but there's a connection in there somehow in terms of another area of the organization to consider as an overall influencer. So I think that it becomes more of a two-way street where we can come with a lot more information and possibly point things out to them that they hadn't considered before, and vice versa. It becomes a real collaboration.
Really interesting. So I wanted to save the best question till last, really,
Okay.
and one we've not rehearsed. But for anybody that's watching the podcast, this is your bonus right now. In your considered opinion, and you are the master of this within Ice Blue Sky, Andrew. I'll give you that status. What makes a good prompt? Because we know that obviously to get great content is all around a great prompt. And for anyone listening, what bit of advice would you give people to create great content through prompting? It's
interesting because I think if you think back to the, not that long ago, when you would put a brief forward to a creative team, and a prompt is sort of a similar thing. When you put a brief through to a creative team, a lot of times what you try to do is you create a very brief document that's very structured and has some real high notes in it, and some real strong insights. When you're building out a prompt for an AI, it's the exact opposite. It's the antithesis of that. You want to be detailed and have as much information in there as possible, because it really needs your structure to help it to then go out and build things off in a, to pull that information in. And it's the depth of information that you can put them. So, long prompts are not a bad thing, but within the length of prompt, you want to have a structure to it. There has to be an element to it. So there has to be a context, and that's where you kind of set the stage and get it, tell a little story about who they are and what they're doing this particular research for. And then there's the element of what do you want the output to look like. But then a piece that's really, really important is the project library. So you have to be very, very detailed in terms of what sources or information or pieces of knowledge the prompt is allowed to access in order to come up with whatever your end goal is. So because if you don't do that, that's when you get into the issues of hallucination and other things. So there's a rigor to it, but there's also a breadth to it, which you don't have like when you would traditionally have made a brief in the old days.
Yeah, that's
those
really...
old days, about 3 years ago.
Yeah, what is the old days? I always say this about you and I, Andrew. We are at our stage in the industry, but we're talking about one of the most cutting edge, most really sort of hyper focused piece of technology that marketing and sales are sort of using. So it's great that we are so enthusiastic about it. And certainly, if we go back, I don't know, 2.5 years, we weren't even having these conversations. So no. It's really great to see. Well, look, listen, I've really enjoyed this conversation, and for the purposes of time, we've got to wrap up now. But we'll get you back, because what I'd like to do is start talking about some real world case studies and outputs, and where we've seen the great successes, but also as well to report on some of the fails that we've noticed and some of that learning. So for today, that's it. That's a wrap from us. Thanks for tuning in, everybody, and we'll see you again next time.